Terry, hello. How are you?
Hey, Lauren, doing great. How are you doing?
I'm really good. Thank you so much for agreeing to have me interrogate you and
Of course. Of course.
answer our questions. You and I have a bit of a similar background. We both have experience with the big consulting firms. So you were with
Hmm.
Bain, I was with BCG. And then from that, we both went into technology, into enterprise technology.
Yeah, yeah,
You into
yeah.
AT&T and me into Dell. And now we are both have multi-year careers as independent consultants. So
That's true.
I
It's
am
true.
super excited to hear what you have to say.
Well,
But let
hopefully it's
me
something useful.
I'm sure it will be. So let me not introduce you. Here's what I would ask you to do. Could you introduce yourself as if you were me introducing you? Like how would someone else introduce Terry?
Well, I think it really depends on the audience, but a lot of times it just boils down to, I'm an independent management consultant. I do a lot of work primarily with telecommunications companies and specifically small rural companies across the U.S. And I do a lot of your traditional strategic planning and advisory kind of work with them. And I also do you stretch out and try other things and do grants. I do a little exit and transition planning for business owners as part of that. Uh, but at the end of the day, it comes back to that independent, and small consultant.
Yeah. So, talk us a bit through the career trajectory that led up to you becoming independent and like what
Mm,
was that decision like? How did
sure.
that happen for you?
Yeah, I think it took for it. It was definitely a process. And I think like I went into corporate. And corporate was great. I continued to grow and learn, but I'd also worked in the federal government at one point in my career. And I'm not sure who had more bureaucracy at the time, corporate or the federal government. And there just comes that time where you just have that itch, that need. It's like, there's just so much that I have to offer. And there's so much potential out there. And I really just want to get out there and kind of control my own destiny. And so that was sort of this journey. It's not something where you just like overnight, you're like, oh, I'm going to go become an independent consultant. It's just something that starts to like this ember that burns until you get to a point and you're convicted. You're like, yes, I'm going to go do this. And that was really for me. And I basically was doing strategy for another firm as well through COVID. And I just came out of COVID. I said, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to do it. So it was the time to actually go ahead and make that jump. I haven't regretted it since.
That's awesome. When you were going through that, did you have any success models, like people you knew that had done this, or were you kind of like, I feel
Well,
like
yeah.
maybe I could just give it a try?
Well, yeah. I mean, I did not necessarily in the top in sort of the management consulting space. I knew some people who'd gone and done, become independent entrepreneurs and things like that. But actually, my dad was, when he left the Marine Corps after a 22-year career, he basically became an independent businessman himself. And so I always had that model in the back of my head, but I've always been struggling like, okay, how do I apply what I know to sell? Because he went in selling like financial products and things like that, where it's very defined, here's your market, here's your product. Whereas I think for a lot of independent consultants, it's always like, well, what is it I do? What's the value that I bring to people? What sets me apart? Because you feel like other people can do the same things. And over time, you realize you're actually really good at certain things that people
Yeah.
just don't have. It's second nature to us. We don't think that it's hard. And so the reality is, it is hard. It's hard for other people. That's where the value is.
How old were you when your dad made that change? Were you still in the house, or was this when you were
Uh,
kind of on your own already?
let's see, I was in high school at the
Okay.
time. So, yeah, so I saw this and frankly, I saw the struggle too, because,
Yeah.
when you go into a new business venture, what I told people, I was having a conversation with a former executive, and he was asking what it's like. And I said, look, you and I have both gone through these business case models, and we see, there's a period of investment and it's down low and then it slowly comes back up. I said, I've never had to live it. When you're living it, it's very different than when you're looking at it on an Excel sheet.
Yeah. How long? I lived it too. How long was that period for you?
It's been about 2.5 to 3 years of kind of
Yeah.
figuring out my way through. And when I've spoken with other people, it seems like there's this magical 3 years.
Hmm.
3 years to cash flow stability, financial stability. Your brand recognition is sufficiently high that you're getting calls coming in. You're not having to search for everything. So it seems to be somewhere in that range. I'm sure other people uh, are a lot faster than I was.
Yeah. No, I've heard the same thing. And in fact, there's a really interesting woman that I hope she will let me interview her. She's based in London, and she's done a study of people like us. She's
Oh, wow.
interviewed, I don't know, she's interviewed like 65 people,
Oh,
and
wow.
she's done a broader, just a regular survey. And she has all of this really interesting data about the why, and this period of transition. And she says the exact same thing. She says 2 to 3 years. I
That's
think it's
true.
anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. I
Hmm.
think depending, and this is what I want to get into because I feel like you're really an excellent success model for someone who very clearly articulates the problem that you solve. I think that for me is like the key. If you can unlock that early, that shortens that time frame. I
Right.
didn't. I totally did not. I was like a generalist for years. And I think, I figured it out despite of that, but I feel like it would have been a lot easier because of that.
Well, you're kind to say. I mean, it's a process, right? And I think there's a lot of learnings because a lot of when I don't know about you, when I started getting into this, everybody was like, you got to niche down, niche down, niche down. And you're like, okay, what's that mean? And okay, come up with your ideal buyer client, and things. And the reality is, when you first start, you don't even know who that is.
Yeah.
You have no idea. And once you get three clients, you realize they're all completely different. And you're still trying to say, okay, I'm just trying to extract something out of this that's complementary. But as you go through the process and over time, you start to realize, hey, I'm really good at this part, and I seem to be getting more, you know, there's more gravity coming from this area, and that's just kind of starts honing in. The hard part is listening to that and trusting it, because I think so many times we're on our own, we're just constantly questioning the direction that we're going. Is this the right way? Should I go this way? Because we don't have that same person bouncing off ideas like we do when we're in the office. And so at some point you get conviction, and then when you just go take that step, then you start to get some progress out of it.
Okay, so without further ado,
Hmm.
what are the problems you solve? Because it's really interesting. You have two niches, which
Yes.
we'll talk about how you do that, but
Yeah.
what are they?
Sure. There's two, as you mentioned. I mentioned one in terms of telecommunications. What I'm
Hmm.
really doing is I am helping what I would call visionary business leaders in that rural broadband space transform their business because the entire model is changing and no one knows how to do that. It's moving from a cost-based model to an ROI-based model. So people don't know how to do that. So that's one area that I work with those who want to make that transition. The other transition is I work with business owners who are also looking to transition where they're trying to move outside and basically move on to the next thing. That could be I want to transition my business to my family. I want to transition to a third party and sell it. I want to transition it to management. So, under this rubric of exit planning, it is really about helping business owners make that transition on their timeline and on their terms. And as we know, having gone through corporate and transactional world, it's not easy. And there's nobody out there who really helps them in that process. So those are sort of the two main areas.
What's the red thread between the two?
You know, in every the thread in both is you're looking to make a transformative change, and you need a guide in that change. In the telco world, it's I need to change to learn how to move from this kind of mindset, this kind of organization to this kind of organization. When you are a business owner, there's a level of discovery first to figure out, well, what is that transition you want to make? Where are you today, and what are we going to need to do to get you ready for that transition? Not just the business, but even you personally. Have
Yeah.
you considered what your life is like when you're not coming into the business every day?
Do you take any of the learnings from your time in high school when your dad went through that and to have those conversations with
Oh,
people?
absolutely, absolutely.
Like what?
Um, he one of the things I really appreciated. My dad kept he uses certain terms. He's talking about like, what's your prospecting strategy? Prospecting, prospecting, prospecting. and I didn't quite get it. And we talk about what's your offer? Okay, what's your offer? And then he had an assessment. And, you take those things, you start putting them together and you realize he says these terms, it's the same thing that we apply today in our business. So prospecting is basically how you go about and find potential leads and clients. How do you communicate your value proposition to them? The offer is like, what are you going to do? What is the problem that you solve? How are you going to go solve that? We talked about the assessment. That's normally our first sort of discovery phase of any project. It's, what is it? Where are we today? Where are you trying to get to? What are the roadblocks we want to get overcome? And effectively, what is that problem statement that we need to really articulate so that we can move forward? And it's just more about translating those things over time, to make that happen.
Okay, so if you have these two different niches that you solve, and I get it, it's like the core skill set, the special sauce of Terry is the same and it applies to both problems. How do you manage telling the world about the two things? Like, do you manage these things completely in separate channels? Like, how does that
Yeah,
work?
it's evolved over time. When I first started, I tried to do them all under my same brand that I'd set up, which is Sunstone Associates. But I realized that that can create some level of confusion in the marketplace. So what I've actually done is I work with a partnering group called Mastery Partners, and that's where I do the exit planning work, and it is just dedicated to that. So all the branding, all the messaging, all the approaches are there. Sunstone I've reserved for just the telecommunications side. And the beauty of doing that is, as I said, you avoid some of that confusion that you run into in the marketplace. The other thing, kind of selfishly, is I love working with the Mastery partners because a lot of those are former business owners. These are folks who've sat in the chair. They have sometimes some different perspectives than I do, and I think that's really valuable for folks. So it's really worked out well. Plus, that also creates, the other thing we talk about in independent consulting is how do you do the work? How do you do it efficiently? And by having that partnership group and the skills and resources they bring to bear, it basically is a force multiplier, allows me to still spend a lot of time on the telco side.
Interesting. Okay. I want to talk about Mastery Partners just for a second before we go talk about the telco stuff, because I think there's some cool marketing things you're doing on the
Hmm.
telco side I'd like to highlight.
Sure.
Um, it looks like I was looking at your LinkedIn before the call, and you invested time in getting a certification in
Yeah.
exit planning. Is that something how did that go? And is it something you'd recommend to others thinking about going into an independent route?
I think there can be value in it. I think you have to, I will say this. I don't think there's this value in the certification in the
Yeah.
context that business owners don't know what my SEPA designation means. They really don't. But in terms of connecting you into a community of other people who are similar to it, learning a process that others have tried and worked, I think that was very valuable. Just to kind of step back a second on the exit planning, what kind of brought me to it, and it goes back actually to the telco side. I had a client call me and say, "Hey, um, I need a pro forma financial budget." I'm like, "Okay, why?" "Well, I'm trying to sell the business." "Okay, why do they need a pro forma financial forecast?" "Well, they don't understand this part of my business." "Well, tell me about that part of the business." And so this continued a conversation. And I said, you don't need a pro forma financial business. We need to fix that part of the business because that's what's holding up your transaction. So I went and I got to meeting with them. And long story short, these are wonderful people. It was a husband and wife who'd built a business over 20 years. They had tried to sell it multiple times, but it just was never working. And it was so obvious for somebody like, you or me going in, oh yeah, these are the issues that need to get addressed. And that led me to say, there's got to be a better way. There has to be somebody who can actually help the business owners in that process. Someone who's not walking in saying, I want to sell your business, just saying, what do you want to do? Let me help you get you there. And that's what led me to all the research. There's different organizations around exit planning. I work with the Exit Planning Institute. I like the approach. It made a lot of sense coming from a consulting background. It's sort of the assess where you are. We use opinions of value. We correlate those with different factors in the business, say these pieces are more important than those. Let's fix those first. And then create the plan, execute the plan, put it on quarterly So, I mean, this is every business project you've been on, in management consulting. It's just on a smaller scale. And so that's what really kind of led me to that. And then from there, it was like, okay, now I've got the designation, I've got the learning. How do I sell? How do I get a market? How do I find exactly where my niche is? And that's experimentation. It's like everything else.
Okay, back over to telecom. Let's talk about the telecom corner.
Okay, sure.
So here's what I know. So don't understand the tech. I've read it. Okay, I read
Okay.
it. I see your name in my Gmail every week, every
Mhm.
other week at some regular basis. And you and I met 2 years ago, and I never forgot about you.
Wow,
So
thanks.
tell
Yeah,
us, what is the telecom corner? Like,
yeah.
what are you
I
doing
mean,
with it?
I think this has been sort of a labor of love. It's evolved over time. When I first started this, I actually, if there's a book, Vivid Vision, if you've ever,
Oh, no, I've read it.
yes, yep.
Yep.
And so I sat down and I wrote a vivid vision for my business, and one of the elements was going to be this newsletter because I wanted to come up with topics that are relevant, and I always felt like I just have a different take because I was on the inside and I understand sort of motivations, which not everybody does. And I also sort of understand the tech just enough. And at first, I did my first year was just like email and I just wouldn't go anywhere. But then the beauty of LinkedIn is you set up a newsletter and people sign up for it. It's coming into their email every single time you publish. And so I was like, look, I'm just going to go forward with this idea and I'm going to do something every week. And so every Friday, I sort of have that moment. It's like, oh, what am I going to write about this week? But I go through the news articles. I say, you know what? People don't need to know more about that. That's kind of interesting. And I pick things that are not necessarily always the big news of the day because that's so well covered. What I try to do is pick things that maybe are very interesting. They influence those that people don't understand. And I'll normally go through and say, well, here's first of all what you need to know. Here's how it came about. Here's why it's important. And then, by the way, if you care about this topic, here's some things you should be thinking about. And then I use that as a way to start, building up a bit more of a brand presence. I've got several hundred followers, all sort of in my target client set now. And it opens up conversations. It makes me an expert and allows me to to sell back into that market. So it's been a lot of fun. I mean, I'm sure, very similar to things you do.
Do you write it yourself? So you really write it yourself?
I do. I do. I have a social media manager. She's fantastic. But what
Okay.
we discovered is like I just know the topics
Nobody can
and
replace you. Yeah.
it's very difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. Like you could do Chat GPT, but you're not going to get the way I'm going to look at it.
Yeah.
And so I just said, look, I'll do it. You make it prettier. You get my English fixed. Um, and she takes care of all that stuff. But the other thing is for those who are listening, what I'll do is I'll look through and say each week, who are my new subscribers? And I'll just send them a little link to thanks. Hey, great connecting with you. Thank you for following. If there's ever anything I can do to help you, either me or my network, I hope you'll reach out. If you have any feedback, I'd love any thoughts.
Yeah.
And
Okay. So
some people respond to that.
yeah. Okay. So here's what I love about it. By the way, I don't see anybody else doing this.
Really?
Like, no, I don't. It's crazy. If people are, like, please let me know. So we have our newsletter, but it's completely different. It's not client facing at all. I feel like maybe we should do that, but I don't. The telecom corner is covering some very, you may not agree, but from my perspective, some really like the intersection of technical and regulatory and business issues. These are things that are very, very unique and complicated and have impact to the people within this industry. And as an outsider, you read it and frankly, like you're not going to get it, but that's what makes it so great because it is obviously targeted to your customer.
Yeah.
And the fact that you write this, how much time do you put into it?
A couple hours a week.
Couple hours a week. So
Yeah.
that's not nothing, right? I mean, let's call it 3 hours a week. That's a pretty big chunk of time. But every week there you are in the inbox talking about smart stuff related to a very specific problem that you solve for a very specific target customer. And I think it is an absolutely great example. I really do.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate
Yeah.
it. I it's been something that has definitely opened doors. It's
Mm-hmm.
made connections for me. Um, Not always client connections, maybe potential partners, but it has definitely expanded my set. And I start to look through who the followers are, and I'm like, oh wow, this person's now following the newsletter, and hey, that's a public official, and so those are the kinds of things where like, okay, I'm not saying anything, everything I say is not completely wrong, so somebody's agreeing with where I'm going with it.
Are you looking to grow the business, or are you at a good steady state for what you want to do right now in your life?
I'm always trying to grow, always trying to
Okay.
grow. I think I'm about 3.5 years in, and so I
Okay.
really want to. I'm still trying to get to that level where, in full disclosure, I had a great year this last year, but I didn't make as much yet as I did when I was in corporate. I'm still on that curve, but every year it has been better and better and better. And this year, like I said, was pretty good. So I still have some path to go
Okay.
to do that, and I think a lot of that's about getting that offer really well defined down, repeatable, selling. Um, but it's just a fun ride.
Yeah. My guess too is that you left your corporate job at a pretty senior level.
I
So
did.
I did
Yeah.
not. So it was somewhat easy to replace my income when I was 34 years old, it was a lot
Yeah.
easier.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Yeah. It's well. The funny thing is, and I don't know about you. So the challenge I found is sort of that period where I left is I was that, and I've talked to this another independent consultant. He described it perfectly. He said, I was in corporate. I did really well. I went up. It's like I wasn't that person all the way up. I was sort of that person behind them and kept, took care of them. The problem with that is that your network, when you leave, is generally inside that company. When you're in the senior level, your network actually is outside the company.
yeah.
So when you leave as an independent consultant, if you leave at that level, the first hard part is convincing people that you were involved in some of these really big transformative things. I mean, I had lots of conversations. I'd have to sort of say, oh, well, about this. Well, that's why they did that. Well, wait a minute, you weren't involved in that. So, yeah, I was the person sitting behind, doing the actual work.
Yes. It's
That,
actually
yeah,
doing it,
yeah.
guys.
And so then over time, you start to build up this point. But that's just sort of a nuance I found in terms of
Yeah.
where you exit corporate has an impact about your trajectory when you come out as an independent.
That's interesting. Okay, so I have a different take on this actually.
Okay.
I don't trade off of that time at Dell. I trade off the time at BCG. So for what I do is different, right? Like my special thing is I make things really clear, really easy to understand, and that gets the executives to buy into things, invest in things, and get your team to make things happen. And with that, I feel like I trade off a lot of the strategy consulting versus the time at Dell. Dell got me in the door at Microsoft because I had it on my resume. It
Mm-hmm.
also helped me skill wise. Like people at Dell, anyone that's at Dell will laugh when I say this. They can get amazing things done fast because it's like people are barking crazy orders at them all the time. They're just a machine,
Yeah.
more so than any other company. And so that is a skill that I have, but I don't think it's like a recognized skill outside of for like outsiders that don't look in. Um,
That's fair.
so it's a little bit different. Yeah.
No, that's fair, and I think we all have different perspectives on that. It's I translate back to where does my work come from, and my work has come from the work that I've put in after I left AT&T to build
Yeah.
out relationships, not
Yeah.
necessarily the AT&T piece.
Awesome. Okay, so to close us out, I have one question.
Mhm.
Um, go back 4 years. What advice would you give yourself?
I think A is do it. Don't question it. Um, B is get a coach early. I think that I found an amazing coach, but I found her along the way. Had I had her a year earlier, I probably could have accelerated at least 6 months to a year in terms of my ramp up. There's just something magical about somebody who's been there and done that before, and you learn, oh yeah, here's how you price. When they say value proposition, here's what you mean. When you say a pitch, here's what you mean. Because we don't know how to necessarily sell naturally
Yeah.
unless you're just good at it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that. And then the other thing is when you think about niching is pick a direction. It doesn't mean that it has to be this narrow. You may have, pick an industry, pick a specific functional area, but just try two or three different things. Don't feel like you have to be so pigeonholed on one thing. That will actually accelerate your timelines.
Well, thank you so much, as always, for a really fun conversation and so much insight, especially to those people who are really thinking about like, what should I do this? What does it look like? I think it's awesome. And congratulations on all your success. And thanks. This is going to come out soon.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lauren. I appreciate it. Thanks for making the time. And good luck with all the great stuff that you're doing and helping folks get, accelerate that curve.